In a small town in Vermont, a man spent most of his adult life doing two jobs that nobody would ever associate with serious wealth. For part of the day, he pumped gas at a local filling station, checking oil, cleaning windshields, the kind of work that gets described, politely, as humble. For the other part of the day, he swept floors and emptied trash cans as a janitor at a nearby department store. He wore the same worn winter coat for years, fixed it himself with safety pins when it started falling apart rather than buying a new one, and split his own firewood well into his 80s because paying someone else to do it felt like an unnecessary expense. Nobody in his town considered him wealthy. Nobody, including most of his own family, had any real idea what was actually sitting in his accounts. When he passed away at the age of 92, the number that came out of his estate stunned nearly everyone who had ever known him. $8 million. Not 8 million in some fantasy sense. $8 million. Real, verified, accumulated slowly over decades by a man who spent his entire life doing two of the most unglamorous jobs imaginable. Here's the detail that makes this story so much stranger, and honestly, so much more useful than it first appears. Around the exact same time, this other man had an Ivy League degree, an accomplished career at one of the most prestigious financial firms in the world. He'd worked as an executive at Merrill Lynch, retired early, wealthy enough to build an entire second wing onto his house, specifically to host lavish charity events. And yet, within a handful of years, he filed for bankruptcy. His fortune collapsed by a combination of heavy borrowing and market conditions that turned sharply against him. Two men. One swept floors and pumped gas for a living, wore a coat held together with safety pins, and quietly amassed $8 million nobody knew about. The other had every credential our culture associates with financial genius, and still ended up bankrupt. Here's the question that's going to sit with you for the rest of this video, because it cuts against almost everything we're taught to believe about money. If financial success isn't primarily about intelligence or credentials or even income, what is it actually about? There's a writer who spent years studying exactly this question, not as an academic exercise, but because he'd noticed something strange, something that kept repeating itself across decades of financial history. The people who built lasting wealth and the people who understood financial theory best were very often not the same people at all. His name is Morgan Housel, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why he believes financial success has far less to do with what you know, and far more to do with how you behave. Why two people can look at the exact same set of facts and make completely different, equally reasonable decisions, and why one specific idea, something he calls the highest dividend money actually pays, gets almost completely ignored by nearly everyone chasing wealth in the first place. Stick with me, because we're going to spend real time on the specific forces that separate people like that quiet janitor from people like that bankrupt executive, and one of them, the very first one, is going to feel deeply uncomfortable, because it's a force almost nobody wants to admit actually controls a huge portion of their financial life. Let's start there, because it's the foundation everything else in this story is built on. Picture two people, born in the same decade, similarly intelligent, similarly hard-working, making similar decisions with their money throughout their lives. One of them happens to start investing right before a historic, multi-decade bull market. The other happens to start investing right before a historic crash that takes years to recover from. Neither of them did anything meaningfully different. Neither of them was smarter, or more disciplined, or more insightful than the other. And yet, decades later, their financial outcomes could be dramatically, almost unrecognizably different, purely because of when they happened to be born, entirely outside of their own control. Housel calls this force luck, and its quiet, less discussed twin, risk. And he argues that almost every financial outcome you've ever admired or judged in someone else's life contains a meaningful amount of both, hidden just beneath the surface, almost never accounted for in the stories we tell about success and failure. Here's a specific example that tends to reframe how people think about famous success stories once they really sit with it. One of the most successful entrepreneurs in modern history attended a specific high school that happened to have access to an early computer terminal, an extraordinarily rare resource at the time, decades before personal computers became common in most schools at all. That single stroke of luck, being born into a family that could afford that particular school at that particular moment in computing history, gave him an early head start. None of this is meant to diminish the genuine skill, the genuine hard work. It's meant to highlight something Housel argues gets almost completely erased from the story once someone becomes successful, which is the enormous role that circumstances entirely outside anyone's control played in making that success possible in the first place. Here's the twist that makes this idea genuinely uncomfortable and worth sitting with directly. If luck plays a meaningful role in success, then risk, its less glamorous twin, plays an equally meaningful role in failure, meaning some of the people you've judged harshly for poor financial decisions were, in some cases, simply on the unlucky side of circumstances that were never fully within their control either. There's a story Housel tells of two friends who attended business school together, similarly talented, similarly ambitious, who both went on to start their own companies around the same time, using remarkably similar strategies. One of them happened to launch right before an economic downturn crushed his particular industry. The other happened to launch into rapidly growing demand that had nothing to do with either of their individual skill or planning. One failed, one succeeded enormously. And for years afterward, people told two very different stories about these two men. One a cautionary tale about poor business judgment, the other a celebrated case study in strategic brilliance, when in reality, according to Housel's own account, the actual difference between their strategies was smaller than almost anyone assumed, and the actual difference in timing, in luck, in risk, was far larger than anyone wanted to admit. Here's the pause worth taking right now, honestly, with nobody else watching. The next time you're tempted to fully credit someone's financial success entirely to their own brilliance, or fully blame someone's financial failure entirely on their own foolishness, ask yourself how much of the actual story you're not seeing, how much luck or risk sits quietly underneath the surface of a narrative that's almost always told far more simply than the reality actually was. Now let's go back to that janitor in Vermont, because his story reveals something else entirely, something that has nothing to do with luck at all, and everything to do with a force so quiet, so unglamorous, that almost nobody gives it the credit it actually deserves: compounding. Here's a fact that genuinely surprises people the first time they hear it clearly stated. The overwhelming majority of one of history's most famous investors' fortune, someone whose name has become almost synonymous with investing success, was actually built after he turned 50 years old. Not because his investment strategy suddenly became dramatically better in his 50s, because he'd simply been investing patiently, consistently, for decades before that point, and compounding, given enough time, eventually starts producing numbers so large they look almost unbelievable, even though the underlying process never actually changed at all. If he'd started investing at the exact same skill level, but decades later in life, giving compounding far less time to actually work. His final fortune would have been a small fraction of what it actually became, despite using the exact same strategy, the exact same skill, the exact same decisions. This is precisely why that quiet janitor in Vermont ended up with $8 million, and it had almost nothing to do with picking brilliant investment. He simply started early, stayed consistent for an extraordinarily long period of time, and never interrupted the process, never panicked and sold during a downturn, never needed to withdraw the money for some unexpected emergency, because he'd also built a life modest enough that emergencies rarely required touching his investments at all. Time did almost all of the actual work. Here's a comparison worth sitting with, because it illustrates just how counterintuitive this idea genuinely is. Imagine two investors, one who invests a modest amount every year for 40 straight years, and another who invests a much larger amount, but only for the final 10 years of that same 40-year period, trying to catch up quickly toward the end. Even though the second investor puts in significantly more total money, the first investor, the one who simply started decades earlier and let compounding run for far longer, this is the specific mechanism that made that Vermont janitor's fortune possible. And it's also the specific mechanism that most people, understandably, chronically, underestimate, because compounding doesn't feel dramatic while it's happening. For the first several years, the numbers barely move at all, and it's easy to look at slow, unremarkable early growth and assume the whole strategy simply isn't working, right before the process eventually accelerates into something that looks, from the outside, almost magical. Here's the twist that connects this directly back to that bankrupt Wall Street executive from earlier. His downfall wasn't really about a lack of financial knowledge. He almost certainly understood compounding, understood markets, understood investment theory better than that quiet Vermont janitor ever did. His downfall was about a completely different force. One Housel argues is actually more dangerous than not knowing enough, and that force is the inability to survive long enough for compounding to keep working uninterrupted. He'd taken on significant debt, using borrowed money to amplify his existing wealth, and when market conditions turned sharply against him, that leverage, downturn, without needing to sell anything at all. This brings us to one of the most important distinctions in Housel's entire philosophy, something he separates carefully into two completely different skills that most people, understandably, lump together as though they're the exact same thing. Getting wealthy and staying wealthy are not the same skill at all. Getting wealthy often requires some combination of optimism, calculated risk, taking, putting yourself out there in ways that could genuinely fail. Staying wealthy requires something almost entirely opposite: humility, a healthy fear of losing what you've already built, and a constant awareness that past success never guarantees future success, no matter how confident it might feel in the moment. Housel argues that a huge number of financial disasters throughout history happened precisely at the intersection of these two skills, when someone who got wealthy through aggressive risk taking never adjusts their behavior once they actually have something significant left to lose, continuing to take the same large risks that built their fortune in the first place, right up until one of those risks finally goes wrong at exactly the wrong moment. There's a story of an investor who built a genuinely impressive fortune over about 15 years, using an aggressive, high-conviction strategy that worked spectacularly well during that entire stretch. He became known in his circle as someone with an almost uncanny ability to pick winning investments, and that reputation, understandably, gave him enormous confidence. But instead of gradually reducing his risk as his fortune grew larger, protecting what he'd already built, He kept using the exact same aggressive strategy, assuming his track record would simply continue indefinitely. A single market event, one he genuinely couldn't have fully predicted, wiped out a substantial portion of that fortune in a matter of months, not because his overall strategy had been foolish across those 15 years, but because he'd never built in enough room for the one scenario where his strategy eventually failed, which, statistically, given enough time, it eventually was always going to. This introduces a concept Housel treats as genuinely essential, something he calls room for error, and it's worth understanding clearly because it explains why some of the most financially successful people you'll ever encounter often look, from the outside, almost overly cautious. Room for error means deliberately planning your finances so that you can survive being wrong, survive an unexpected downturn, survive a piece of bad luck you never saw coming without that single event derailing your entire financial future. It means not investing so aggressively that a single bad year forces you to sell everything at exactly the worst possible moment. It means keeping enough of a cash cushion that an unexpected job loss doesn't force you into high-interest debt just to cover a few months of ordinary expenses. Here's the specific reason room for error matters so much more than most people initially assume. Housel argues that the single most valuable asset in all of investing isn't intelligence or connections or even capital itself. It's time, specifically, the ability to remain invested, uninterrupted, for as long as possible, letting compounding do the vast majority of the actual work. And the single greatest threat to that uninterrupted time isn't a bad investment decision. It's being forced by circumstances outside your control. A market crash combined with too much personal debt have eventually recovered entirely on its own. Here's a question worth sitting with right now, honestly, with nobody watching. If your entire financial situation were hit by a genuinely bad piece of luck tomorrow, a job loss, a market downturn, an unexpected expense, do you have enough room built into your finances to survive that event without being forced into a decision you deeply regret making? Because, according to this entire body of research, now let's talk about something Housel argues sits at the very heart of nearly every financial decision. Here's the distinction, and it's genuinely subtle the first time you encounter it. A purely rational financial decision is one that makes perfect sense on a spreadsheet, optimized entirely for the highest possible mathematical return, without any regard for how that decision actually feels to the specific human being living inside it. A reasonable financial decision is one that makes sense given your own specific fears, your own specific values, your own specific emotional relationship with money, even if it isn't technically the mathematically optimal choice available to you. There's a story of a woman who, despite understanding intellectually that a slightly more aggressive investment strategy would likely produce higher returns over the long run, chose instead to keep a meaningfully larger cash reserve than most financial advisors would technically recommend, because she'd grown up in a household where sudden financial instability had caused genuine, lasting anxiety, and having that extra cushion allowed her to sleep peacefully at night in a way that a marginally higher expected return never could have. A purely rational advisor might have told her she was leaving money on the table. But Housel's argument is that a strategy you can't actually stick with emotionally, one that causes so much anxiety you eventually panic and abandon it at exactly the wrong moment, is worth far less in practice than a slightly less optimal strategy you can genuinely maintain calmly for decades without ever being tempted to deviate from it out of fear. This connects directly back to something we touched on earlier with that bankrupt executive, and it's worth stating clearly. The best financial plan isn't the one that looks most impressive on paper. It's the one you'll actually follow consistently through every market downturn, every unexpected life event, every moment of genuine fear, without abandoning it right before it was about to work. Now let's talk about a concept Housel treats with real seriousness, something he simply calls enough, because understanding it might be one of the most protective ideas in this entire philosophy. There's a specific danger that tends to affect people who have already achieved significant financial success, a danger that has very little to do with market risk and everything to do with a psychological trap that's claimed far more fortunes than most people realize. The trap is this: once someone has already achieved more wealth than they could reasonably need for the rest of their life, some part of them still keeps pushing for more, taking on risks that make no rational sense given how much they already have, purely because the goalposts of enough kept quietly moving further away every time they got close to them. There are well-documented cases throughout financial history of executives, already extraordinarily wealthy by any reasonable measure, who nonetheless engaged in illegal insider trading or fraudulent schemes to gain even more, ultimately losing not just additional wealth, but their reputation, their freedom, and everything they'd already legitimately built, all in pursuit of an amount of money that could never have meaningfully improved their lives beyond what they already had. Housel's argument here is genuinely sobering and worth sitting with directly. The hardest financial skill isn't earning money, and it isn't even growing money. It's knowing when you have enough and having the discipline to stop reaching for more, going to change your actual quality of life in any meaningful way. There's a quieter, less dramatic version of this same trap that affects nearly everyone, not just the extraordinarily wealthy. It's the version where your own definition of enough keeps quietly inflating alongside your income, where a raise that once would have felt like more than enough somehow gets absorbed within months into a slightly larger version of the exact same financial anxiety you had before, because the target itself kept moving right alongside your paycheck. Here's a pause worth sitting with, honestly, right now. If your income doubled tomorrow, would you actually feel like you finally had enough? Or would some part of you simply move the goalposts further away, exactly like it may have done every single time your income has grown in the past? Now let's talk about something Housel calls. Here's the surprising claim, and it's worth sitting with carefully because it contradicts how most people intuitively think about investment success. A small number of individual investments, a small fraction of all the total decisions made across an entire investing career, are typically responsible for the overwhelming majority of total returns, while the vast majority of individual decisions turn out to be mediocre, unremarkable, or even outright losses. This pattern shows up again and again throughout financial history, in individual stock performance, in venture capital portfolios, in the broader stock market itself, where a relatively small number of companies end up driving a disproportionate share of the market's entire long-term growth, while a much larger number of companies simply underperform or fail entirely. Here's why this matters so much practically, and it's genuinely counterintuitive the first time you really absorb it. An investor doesn't actually need to be right most of the time to be enormously successful overall. They simply need to avoid being forced out of the game through panic selling, through excessive debt, through impatience, before those rare, powerful tail events have the chance to occur and fully play out. There's a story of an early investor in a now well-known technology company, someone who made dozens of other investments across his career that performed only moderately or lost money entirely, and yet, because he remained patient enough to hold on to that one specific position through years of, ordinary-looking growth, that single investment alone eventually generated more total return if he'd sold early out of impatience or fear, or simply because the position looked unremarkable for years before it eventually took off. None of that later success would have ever happened at all. This directly reinforces something we touched on earlier, and it's worth restating clearly here. Staying in the game patiently, without being forced out by panic or poor planning, matters more than almost any individual decision you'll ever make, because you genuinely never know in advance which specific decision is going to be the rare, powerful one that ends up carrying the majority of your entire financial outcome. Now let's bring all of this together into the single idea Housel argues matters more than almost anything else in this entire philosophy, something he calls the highest dividend that money actually pays. Here's the question worth asking directly, and it might reframe everything you've just heard. What is money actually for? Most people, if asked directly, would answer with some version of buying things: a nicer house, a nicer car, more experiences, more comfort, and all of that is genuinely true to a point. But Housel argues there's something money buys that matters far more than any specific purchase, something so valuable that it deserves to be treated as the actual primary goal of building wealth in the first place, rather than a pleasant side effect of it. Control over your own time, the ability to wake up and decide genuinely for yourself how you're going to spend your day without being forced into decisions by financial desperation, without needing to tolerate a job you dislike, or a boss who treats you poorly, or a stressful circumstance you'd otherwise leave immediately. Purely because you don't have the financial cushion to walk away. This is why that quiet janitor in Vermont, despite never living anything close to a glamorous lifestyle, may have actually been genuinely wealthier, in the way that matters most, than plenty of people earning far more money, but trapped by lifestyles, debts, and obligations that gave them almost no real control over their own daily lives at all. Here's the modern application worth genuinely acting on this week, something concrete, something worth actually sitting with. Ask yourself honestly, how much of your current financial decisions are actually oriented toward buying yourself more control over your own time, versus how many are oriented purely toward visible status, toward things that look impressive to other people, but quietly cost you flexibility, options, and genuine peace of mind in exchange. Because, according to this entire body of research, the version of wealth that actually improves how your life feels day to day, year to year, was never really about the size of the number in your account. It was about how much control that number actually gives you over your own limited time, and how much room for error it gives you to survive the inevitable moments when luck, risk, and simple bad timing show up uninvited, exactly like they eventually do in almost everyone's financial life at some point. Let's bring this into the world you're actually living in right now, because the specific pressures working against clear thinking about money have arguably intensified since Housel first wrote about all of this. Social media has created a constant, curated stream of other people's apparent financial success without ever showing the underlying luck, the underlying risk, or the underlying room for error that might be sitting quietly behind each of those glossy moments, making it easier than ever to compare your own quiet, patient progress against someone else's highlight reel and feel unfairly like you're falling behind. Trends that reward short-term speculation over long-term patience move faster and louder than ever, tempting people to abandon a slow, boring, compounding strategy in favor of something that promises faster results right before that faster strategy, statistically, fails far more often than it succeeds. and the temptation to keep moving your own personal definition of enough further away every time you get close to it has arguably never been stronger. In a culture that constantly shows you a slightly larger version of success just one scroll away. Let's return, one final time, to that quiet man in Vermont, splitting his own firewood well into his 80s, wearing a coat held together with safety pins, sweeping floors for a living, while quietly building $8 million that almost nobody around him ever suspected existed. He wasn't a financial genius proper. He never claimed to understand markets better than anyone else. He simply started early, stayed patient for an extraordinarily long time, avoided the kind of debt and lifestyle that would have forced him to sell at the wrong moment, and let compounding, quietly, invisibly, do almost all of the actual work across several decades of an otherwise completely ordinary life. That is the actual heartbeat of everything we've walked through together today. Financial success was never primarily a math problem, solvable purely through intelligence or credentials or income. It's a psychology problem, governed by luck you can't control, risk you have to plan for, patience that almost never feels rewarding while it's happening, and a definition of enough that only you can actually decide for yourself. If this reframing of what money is actually for resonated with you at all, there's a simple, easy way to make sure you never miss the next story like this one. And honestly, that's really the only thing I'll ever ask of you. Because somewhere out there right now, there's another quiet person doing an unglamorous job, making patient, boring, consistent decisions that nobody around them will ever fully notice, building something that won't look impressive for years, right up until one day, decades from now, it very quietly does. I'll see you in the next one.